like to talk about immigration, both contemporary immigration, largely from Latin America and into the United States, but also in a much wider realm of the history of immigration. And to start, I'd like to make some sweeping statements. One simply is that people largely immigrate from the non-West to the West. As soon as I've said that politically incorrect declaration, I have to qualify it. First of all, what do we mean by the West? The West does not mean white people or European people. It's a system of thinking. It's a system of culture. It's a system of civilization. What do I mean by that? It has a greater propensity, the Westerner, to embrace constitutional government. Second, there's a greater propensity to value private property and to have open markets that creates more goods and services. There tends to be a greater freedom of the individual. There tends to be a greater reliance on rationalism, or the idea of scientific inquiry to adjudicate natural phenomenon rather than just religion or superstition or tradition. There's a greater tolerance for differing religions, and especially the notion of secularism, that religion shall not adjudicate or dictate politics. Okay, you put all of that Western menu, all those items of the West into a menu, and what do you have? You have a greater likelihood of prosperity, security, and freedom, and more people want to join that system. That would mean that in antiquity, Greeks in Athens or Thebes or Corinth had people come from Phoenicia or from Libya or from Egypt, and a greater likelihood that Greeks wish to go to their countries and live as they do. And here's the great qualifier. I do not mean that Westerners don't leave the West, but they do for both good and really bad reasons. They leave the West to enter the non-West to what? To exploit it, to conquer it, to colonize it, to set up an imperial system, but rarely to live as non-Westerners. The reverse is not true. When somebody from India goes to Britain, he lives as a British person. When a British person in the 19th century went to India, he lives as somebody who's British. And the answer is simply not because one system is divine and one is satanic, but one system gives a greater likelihood of economic security, physical, material security, and freedom. I think everybody accepts that, whether we're looking at the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, or 19th century Europe, or contemporary America. People go to the West to create a new life. People leave the West to the non-West to exploit it or to have some type of imperial system or to colonize it. Okay, what does all that mean today in America? If you accept that, that means that if you have a Western country next to a Western country, you really don't have a immigration question. So you have 20 or 30,000 people in the United States, they immigrate to Canada. 20 or 30,000 people immigrate to the United States from Canada. There can be individual taste, individual opportunities, questions of climate, questions of weather, but essentially Canada is a Western country, the United States is a Western country. Americans can go to Australia, and they do, and Australians come to America, and they're within the boundaries of the West. Today, if you could, Americans might want to go live in China as Chinese because it's becoming Western. But note something. Until very recently, you could not go to Japan or China and say that you wanted to be Japanese because their systems adjudicated citizenship on the basis of your racial characteristics. That was true in part at the beginning of the West, but because of the Western notion of freedom and constitutional government, it was an evolving concept, so that people could come from China or Japan or Africa and be fully Western, because the Western mind is what adjudicated culture, not how you looked. And that brings us to the 20th century, and more importantly, the 21st century, and the phenomenon of millions of people, today some 11 million, who come from Mexico, even illegally if they can, to have a chance to live in a Western country. Because when you have a Western country juxtaposed to a non-Western country, you have such differences in economics, in politics, in social life, in security, that it would be natural for one person to want to leave another. The United States had a paradigm called the melting pot, and it simply said, we are the best of the Western tradition. We offer in this new continent constitutional government, economic liberty, a Bill of Rights, religious freedom, a society adjudicated by science and reason. However, if you were to come, then you are making a vote de facto that you are rejecting your prior cargo of cultural and political and economic attitudes, and you must become Westerners. And we have ways to do it. We can intermarry you, we can assimilate you, we can integrate you, but basically it is a melting pot, e pluribus unum. We'll make one country of citizens who look all of different sorts, but one culture. That was pretty much responsible for the history of the United States, and it was in line with the general ideas about immigration. Within that paradigm, there will be Americans that will say, you know what, I want to open a factory in China. Or there'll be somebody who says, I want to go conquer the Philippines. Or there will be somebody who says, I want to be a missionary in Japan. But they will not say, let's take 1 million Americans and go enjoy Chinese life under Chinese conditions. It just didn't happen. We're empirical here, we're not ideological, we're just relating what happens. So all of a sudden, somewhere, what was the year? Was it 1965? Was it 1980? Was it 2000? Was it 2010? When the Western attitudes toward immigration started to implode. We, the hosts, said, you know what? We're no longer convinced that the Western condition is superior to any other, especially the American version of it. So if you come to the United States, we will allow you to have your language, or we will allow you to have your customs. Now, we're not talking here about food and fashion and music, the periphery of culture. The United States was always enriched by Caribbean music, Chinese food, dress from Africa, but we said periphery. We didn't say the core of Western values. We do not want Nigerian ideas of government. We don't want Japanese notions of free speech. We do not want Mexican notions of private property. You come and you enrich around the periphery, but you accept the core, and then the result is that the Westerner, and as I said, in particular the American, doesn't look like anybody. Somebody can go abroad, he can be black, he can be yellow, he can be white, he can be brown, but he's an American by the basis of his ideology and the culture that he accepts. Suddenly that imploded, and it imploded because we, the host, being American, forgot that. And we were convinced that perhaps we were culpable, perhaps we were too wealthy, perhaps we live in a zero-sum game where our wealth comes not because we created it, but because we took it from somebody. Whatever the particular reason was, we, the host, at the end of the 20th century, decided not to assimilate, integrate, intermarry, and change people into us. And the result is that we started to have large numbers of people who fled miserable conditions in Latin America, and in particular Mexico. And as they went northward, unlike their ancestors who came from Mexico and Latin America, they decided they did not have to fully integrate or assimilate. And the result today is we have about 11 to 12, perhaps 15 million illegal aliens from Latin America within the United States. And we don't know what to do. We don't know what to do because many of them do not have English as a proficient language. Many of them have no college degree. Many of them have no high school diploma. Many of them have no legality. In a cutthroat society such as capitalist America, believe me, if you start with strike one, no English, strike two, no high school diploma, and strike three, no legality, you're not going to attain parity in the first and second generation. And that collides with the idea of modernism and radical egalitarianism, that we all have to be fair and equal, that nobody should be any better than anybody else. So we as the host have to do certain things to ensure illegal aliens have parity, but we can't because we don't have confidence in our system anymore. So we can't say if you come to the United States, you have to know English. You should have capital. You should have a high school diploma because that would be, under our new paradigm, insensitive. And the result is essential chaos. And here's where it gets very interesting, because we're told that illegal immigration has moral ramifications, as in wealthy Americans are not kind to illegal aliens. Their illegal aliens are per capita not as wealthy as Americans, or they have to do jobs that Americans won't do. Much of that is true. After all, illegal immigration is a phenomenon of the corporate right wanting cheap labor, and the therapeutic left or the political left or the Catholic Church left, whatever, however we want to term it, wanting more constituents. And hand in glove, they allowed immigration laws and the cultural cargo of assimilation, integration, intermarriage to end up in sort of a new multicultural apartheidism. Okay. But what I would suggest to you is if you look at the history of immigration, it's not very ethical. It's not very moral when someone comes here from Latin America and they do not do it legally and they don't do it with the intention of immediately assimilating. Now, why is that? Let's look at some of the traditional considerations that made legal immigration from all over the world an ethical enterprise. The first thing is when somebody comes to the United States and they're here illegally, both the employer and the employee circumvent labor law. They often are paid in cash, which benefits, at least in the short term, the employee, and the employer does not have to pay FICA and 30%, 35% workers' comp, Social Security, Medicare. That hurts the poor American worker, often the entry-level worker, often the student, often the legal immigrant from Latin America. That's not very ethical to do that. But you must do that once you transgress federal law, which brings us to the second element of immigration from Latin America today. Once you decide to cross into the United States and knowingly do it illegally, that's not the end of the problem, that's the beginning. We often say, well, it's just an infraction, it's an immigration statute after all. But no, it means that the person who enters the United States illegally must have a serial behavior that's illegal. He must apply for a driver's license. He must apply for vaccinations. He must have records where he states that he is a citizen, even though he knows that's not accurate. So you're essentially making the illegal immigrant who knowingly will commit misdemeanor after misdemeanor after misdemeanor. If he gets in an accident and he knows that if he's there when the police come, he must produce proof that he's a U.S. citizen or insurance proof or a driver's license, he may flee the scene of the accident. So it requires exemption after exemption after exemption. There's another element of the law that's very important to remember. You cannot create a system of immigration where the guest chooses, and he's the sole arbitrator of such choice, which federal laws he chooses to obey and which he doesn't, and the host, i.e. the citizen, has no such latitude. Think of it. I come up from Oaxaca. I'm Victor Hanson. I come up from Oaxaca. I enter the United States and I say, you know what? I choose not to follow your immigration law. Let's say that I believe that Alta California and Baja California are the same thing. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was an indigenous resident of California, so I don't see that your arbitrary border means anything. Okay, fine. So you decided to break a statute. But let's say my name is Bill Smith. I'm the host, and I say to Victor Hanson, well, if you broke that law and you're a guest, then I'll break the law. I don't think it's fair for me to have to pay 32% of my income in federal income tax. And Jane Jones says, you know what? I don't like the idea of a cell phone. In other words, outlawing the idea of a cell phone while I am driving. I want to talk on my cell phone while I'm in my car navigating it. In other words, the entire core, the entire basis, the foundation of jurisprudence starts to erode once you allow someone, especially a guest, to pick and choose which laws are kind, believable, ethical, and which aren't. That's not a choice that the citizen or the resident should be allowed to make. There are legislative bodies, there are courts, there's ballot initiatives to handle that discrepancy in a law that you don't like, but yet you must follow. And yet illegal immigration, in quite ethical and amoral fashion, destroys that whole concept. There's a couple of other very strange things about modern illegal immigration into the United States. And that is this idea of remittances. After all, think about it. Mexico today receives about $25 to $30 billion in remittances. Remittances is a fancy word for people coming up, working, saving, going to the Western Union or even on the internet today and sending money back home to people who are impoverished. In aggregate, Latin America, Mexico, including South America, receives about $40 to $50 billion in remittances. And that warps the entire system of immigration. Think about it for a second. Mexico, as we speak, is suing the state of Arizona for enforcing federal statutes when Arizona believes that the federal government did not enforce statutes, so it must mimic in them and do what the federal government won't. Can you ever think of a foreign government suing a state in the United States? They're saying basically, you must take people that are leaving our system. They don't like our government, they like yours, so we're suing you to take them, even if they're illegal. And Mexico goes so far as to make a comic book. Think about what that assumes, a comic book that shows people how to cross the Rio Grande. It assumes two things. Law doesn't matter, break the law and enter the United States, and B, you must be illiterate. We didn't have a system that taught you how to read and write, but that's no problem because we'll have a pictograph that shows you pictures how to cross it. How cynical is that? Why are they cynical? Because of the recipients of $25 billion in remittances from the United States. Now forget the issue with the money's coming from people illegally. Forget the issue that it's draining the California economy or the American Southwest. Just look at another issue. 1/4 of all illegal households, illegal alien households, receive some sorts of benefit. And if we would define some sorts of benefit even more loosely, is not just 100% dependency on social services, but things like legal help, or tuition waivers, or the DREAM Act in California, or food stamps, or Section 8 housing, the number even is more. And in California, it can be up to $8 to $10 billion a year in subsidies to illegal aliens, which gets to my point that it almost mirror images the amount of money sent back to Mexico. And if you look at the United States as a whole, we are spending 10, 15, 20, $30 billion to ensure a humane treatment of illegal aliens. Now you may say they don't have parity yet, but they just came from Oaxaca, one of the close, or Chiapas, or Guadalajara, some of the poorest areas in the world, and yet they're in the United States, and we feel that, as we should feel, that they need some sort of parity. But that some sort of parity translates into the recipient sending $50 billion back to Latin America. It's almost as if you're saying, I come from Mexico, I have a house, but I need help with my lawyer, I need help with feeding my children, I need help with my health care because the wages I earn are not enough because you have a cruel and oppressive system, but not so cruel and oppressive, because if you will subsidize that element of my household expenses, I will have enough money to send back to Mexico to subsidize people who my own government, who I kind of like now, the further I'm away from it, the longer I'm away from it, I kind of like the idea of Mexico, at least to the superficial extent that I'll put a Mexican flag at my house or a decal on my car. I kind of like that Mexico, that I don't live in it, and I don't hold them culpable for not housing and feeding and helping my relatives in Mexico, because I'll step up and give them money because I can, because I've been subsidized by my host government, whom I really don't want to put an American decal or wave the flag to the same extent. How strange is that? And that's what happens, that type of warped parody, irony, cynicism, skepticism, nihilism, whatever you want to call it, that's what happens when you go down that road of illegal immigration. There's a couple of final considerations that make it a very morally suspect enterprise. The notion of Hispanic success. If you look at what legal immigrants from Mexico or Latin America have done in the United States the last 3 generations, you can come up with statistics that show on rates of economic success, rates of welfare usage or not usage, average income, rates of assimilation, rates of integration, rates of intermarriage, however you want to quantify these rather nebulous areas, that the Hispanic, that's also a very generic term, could include anybody from Venezuela to Mexico to Cuba, but the Hispanic community has been successful, roughly commensurate to other groups in the past, the Irish, the Sicilians, etc., Greeks who came in mass. However, if you were to include 11 to 12 million illegal aliens in that larger population, then immediately the per capita income, the educational levels, the levels of criminality start to become apparent in the entire Hispanic community. It's almost as if you're saying that if somebody comes up from Oaxaca with no money and no education, no legality, and is very impoverished and can't find a job, the degree to which he cannot succeed in America will be average with somebody who's a 3rd generation, half Hispanic, and therefore we will come to the conclusion the Hispanic community is in crisis, so we'll have to give affirmative action or state help or be sensitive to a third-generation Hispanic because of a superficial kindred relationship with an illegal alien. In other words, it warps perceptions of Hispanic success, and it turns the whole notion of affirmative action upside down. Because after all, you can live your entire life in Mexico and have nothing to do with the United States and cross the border. And under this perverse system, because of the growing size and clout of the illegal alien community, you can qualify for affirmative action. Now, some of you think that's surreal. I say it's not surreal. I've had students who were illegal aliens from Mexico who were given precedence, not just over American citizens, but over other Hispanic citizens. We have students in the California State University system from out of state who are Hispanic that pay 3 times the tuition rate of in-state residents who are not legal citizens, who happen to come illegally from Mexico. Where am I going with all this? When we talk about illegal immigration, we don't mention 2 things, and they're essential to the dilemma that we now are facing. Number 1, illegal immigration into the American Southwest is part of a 2,500-year phenomenon. Let's accept it, that there are reasons why people want to go from Mexico into the United States and not from Canada in the United States, or not people from California into central Mexico. It's not a question of race. If Mexico tomorrow would open its economy, if it would have an independent, transparent judiciary, if it would respect property rights, if it would have a constitution that guarantees rights of the individual, if it would have a transparent and fair democracy, if it would adopt a free market capitalist system, it would be indistinguishable from Canada, no matter what the climate is, no matter what the weather, what the location, what the appearance of its native citizenry is. So that's what we have to remember, that A, immigration is largely from the non-West to the West, and B, immigration is not a moral, ethical enterprise, at least as it's occurring illegally from Mexico. Legal immigration it's a key to Western dynamism, the idea that we can take anybody from around the world and turn them into a Westerner because we have a shared ideology of the mind. But once we go down that road and we reject assimilation and we reject legality and intermarriage and a melting pot, and especially the idea that a person can pick and choose which federal statute to follow, then we end up with an apartheid community within the bounds of the United States, and we end up with an entirely unethical enterprise masquerading as if it were moral when it is not, and by any stretch of the imagination.